Hello everybody, Raven Knight here. I did a video not too terribly long ago discussing how the new hero skin, Lady Saori, was likely based on the historical figure Tomoe Gozen. It was a fun video and it allowed me to expand my heroes in history a little bit. So I figured there are a few more hero skins I could draw some connections to, so let's do it. And the obvious one I want to start with is Commander Ravier. For those who don't remember, Ravier was a Black Prior hero skin that released alongside the Aphira season of For Honor, which I think was year 6 season 4. I could be missing that. In the lore, Ravier was a Black Prior of Horkos and considered a favorite of Vortigers. She was known for her cruelty, her sadism, and a desire to cause pain. She wore a mask at all times to hide her face, only a few knowing her true expression and face. And when Horkos was suffering continuous losses and setbacks, Astria decided to take a gamble because she'd heard of a sphere far in the distant land of Arabia guarded by a sultana. This sphere had the power to let one peer to the future and see their destiny. So, Astria sent Ravier and a retinue of priors to Arabia to find the sphere and discover the future of Heathmore. Ravier obeyed, and upon reaching Arabia, she discovered a land of prosperity and plenty thanks to the wisdom of its sultana and the sphere. Ravier acted with grace, patience, and humility, showing obeisance to the gullible sultana and feigning a desire for alliances and friendships. After a few days of placating and playing her role, the sultana finally allowed Ravier to see the sphere. After looking into the orb and viewing the future of Horkos and Heathmore, she allowed the facade to fade. She shattered the orb, slaughtered the sultana, and set fire to the palace. She then took her retinue and fled back to Heathmore with all haste to inform Astria of her new knowledge. Of course, the Aphira didn't take this laying down. Led by Heba, the Aphira pursued Ravier back to Heathmore and attacked. And after a very fierce battle, Heba knocked the mask from Ravier and saw her face. The sight gave her pause, and in that hesitation, Ravier managed to escape. Her whereabouts are still unknown. Now, with the lore and the background out of the way, let's talk about who Ravier is based on. Appearance-wise, it's very clear that her design came from the pop culture look for King Baldwin IV. This is made very obvious by that intimidating face mask she wears, which Baldwin is shown wearing in most of his appearances in popular media, although it is important to note he's not noted for wearing it in any historical depictions or assertions. But who is Baldwin IV? Many of you may not be familiar, but you might know him by his other title, the Leper King. Baldwin was born in 1161. 2 years after his birth, his father would become King of Jerusalem. By the time he was 9, he was sent to study under William of Tyre, one of the most brilliant and respected men in the Crusader states. Under William, Baldwin became knowledgeable in the ways of God, of state, of war, and of history. However, William also reported to Baldwin's father that something was wrong with the boy. Upon investigation, it was discovered that Baldwin had leprosy. This was a crippling blow, not only to Baldwin, but to his family. At the time, leprosy was a widely misunderstood disease, many seeing it as a mark of uncleanliness, and that it was a punishment from God or perhaps a sexually transmitted disease. If it was found out that Baldwin had the disease, it could cause unrest and distrust from the people. But, ironically, this not only didn't come to pass, but Baldwin's experience with the disease was relatively positive against others, as Baldwin was a very devout follower of God and was also not sexually active. Therefore, none of the typical tropes associated with the disease could be applied to him. Unfortunately, though, Baldwin wasn't expected to survive into adulthood, as his body was deteriorating from it, and even if he did survive, no woman would ever sleep with a man with leprosy. So it was clear that Baldwin would father no heirs, and his dynasty was likely to end with him. It was not a hopeful future for the young king to be. When Baldwin turned 13, his father died to dysentery, but was still too young to rule himself, so Raymond of Tripoli acted as regent for 2 years until Baldwin was old enough to rule. In 1176, Baldwin assumed the throne. However, while Baldwin was acclimating to his new position, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, Salah ad-Din, was uniting the Islamic world to drive out the Crusaders from the Holy Land. Salah ad-Din was a brilliant military mind and leader and became a bane in the side of the Christians of the Crusader states. As King of Jerusalem, Baldwin would have to contend with him as well. And he did. Very expertly. To the shock of everyone, Salah ad-Din most of all, Baldwin proved himself a match for the Sultan. Baldwin repelled numerous invasions of the Sultan over his short time as king, but it was in 1177 at Montgisard that Baldwin's legacy was truly cemented. It began when Baldwin recaptured Ascalon, restoring southern Palestine to Christian rule. Salah ad-Din's forces arrived to retaliate, and his forces greatly outnumbered Baldwin's. And though Baldwin had just taken Ascalon, he knew his forces could not withstand a full-on direct engagement against Salah ad-Din's massive concerned army, so he had his army take refuge in the newly captured city. Saladin, knowing of Baldwin's affliction, and also knowing he was only 16 years old, thought him weak and not a real threat, so he turned his attention to Jerusalem and led his armies away because he knew with Baldwin and his armies in Ascalon hiding, Jerusalem was right for the taking. But this was to prove a very foolish decision. Baldwin called for aid from the Templar Order and mustered his forces to pursue Saladin all the way to Montgisard. Now there, sources are a bit iffy on the state of the Muslim army. It was stated by the Muslim sources that there were 3 factors that hurt the Islamic forces. One was that Saladin did not consider Baldwin an immediate threat and did not anticipate a counterattack so quickly from a 16-year-old leper king. Second was that Saladin's army, though large, was stretched due to slow supply trains and the necessity of gathering resources from the surrounding territory. And third was that the Muslim army was exhausted from constant travel and various campaigns without real rest. Regardless of the situation and circumstances, when Baldwin's forces caught up to Saladin, he was caught almost completely unaware. It is said that before the battle, Baldwin, who was barely able to stay on his own horse due to the disease, and had almost lost all feeling in one arm, climbed off of his horse, fell to his knees, and prayed to God for victory and deliverance, then stood up again on his own accord and remounted his horse without assistance. A feat that a leper-stricken 16-year-old boy simply would not have been able to do. It was seen as miraculous and drove many of the soldiers around him to tears. When the battle raged, Baldwin was seen in the thick of combat, clinging to his horse and swinging his sword with the same hand, fighting just as furiously as his men. Saladin was caught unawares by the attack, and with his men so strained and worn down, was unable to make a proper counterattack. They were soundly defeated and were forced to retreat with only 10% of Saladin's original strength. It was a crushing defeat, so sound it wouldn't be until Saladin's later victory at Hattin that he would truly redeem himself. The Muslim world was shaken, and Baldwin had cemented his skill and his tenacity to everyone. Now granted, he had suffered some losses. It's estimated that about 1,100 souls were lost in that battle on the Christian side, so it was not a total routing victory, but a victory nonetheless, where Saladin suffered far worse losses than the Christians did. No one expected this sickly child to be anything more than a short-lived king, but instead had crushed the most promising and ingenious sultan Egypt and Syria had seen. Baldwin after that would continue to rule for 3 more years, but in 1180 his condition had grown so severe that he couldn't even ride a horse anymore. Sensing the weakness of Baldwin, Saladin would make another invasion attempt, but Baldwin still made military moves to counter the Sultan. Unfortunately, Baldwin's sickness was beginning to tell, and in desperation Baldwin named a regent to act in his stead, named Guy de Lusignan, his brother-in-law. This was an error in judgment. Guy de Lusignan was a poor leader and made decisions and actions contrary to Baldwin's wishes, even acting without consulting Baldwin on many occasions. Baldwin attempted to put his son, Baldwin V, on the throne, but in the end the disease finally claimed his life, and Baldwin IV died in 1185 at 24 years old. Baldwin's son, who was 5 years old, would die 1 year later after being named de facto king, and Guy de Lusignan would be captured by Saladin at the Battle of Hattin. Saladin would then march on and take Jerusalem just 2 years after Baldwin IV's death. So, now that we've gone on a lengthy history lesson on Baldwin IV, how do he and Ravier compare? Well, not very well at all, really. Baldwin IV was a devout Christian with firm ideologies built on justice, compassion, and reason. He was a scholar educated by the wisest teachers of the time and a fearless leader. Despite his youth and disease, he led from the front lines, inspired his forces, and was beloved by his people and his allies. Ravier, meanwhile, is hated and feared by all but Vortigern and Astria. She is a cruel sadist who believes mercy and compassion to be weaknesses. She takes pleasure in inflicting pain and agony on others. She's also very underhanded, using backstabbing and deception to undermine, deceive, and then assassinate while taking what she wants. Let's face it, both ideologically and militarily, the two are diametric opposites. Only in appearance are the two similar, and even then it's all superficial. The mask Ravier wears is similar to a popular mask Baldwin is shown to wear in modern art and depictions, but there is no historical evidence Baldwin was ever wearing such a mask. The crown of thorns Ravier has as a possible nod to Christian teachings, but Ravier doesn't embody the principles of the faith in her actions as Baldwin did. The only thing they have in common is disfigurement. It said that when Heba knocked off Ravier's mask, she was so horrified by what she saw, she hesitated in killing her. It's not stated that Ravier has leprosy, and in fact, if she did have leprosy, she probably wouldn't be able to fight the way she does, but it's possible for leprosy to disfigure the face, so yeah, maybe. Baldwin's own face was said to have been scarred by the disease, so this may be the one real connection between the two, actually. Further, Ravier's story is a pale reversal of Baldwin's. Ravier led a small force to deceive a sultana, infiltrate her city and castle, gain her trust, win an audience to see the celestial sphere, and then she turns around and backstabs the sultana by killing her and shattering the sphere before fleeing back to Heathmoor. Meanwhile, Baldwin was instead the one suffering invasion after invasion, who led battles in defense of his kingdom and forced back the attackers in open warfare rather than deceptive subterfuge. You know what? Guys, this may be the first time I say this, but Ravier is a terrible representation of Baldwin. This hero in history doesn't embody their counterpart in any meaningful way other than subtle, superficial visual cues. Now, does that mean I hate her? Ravier's design is good. I'll grant it that. It's a really good design, but other than that, her story sucks. You know, I wouldn't mind a gender swap Baldwin character in For Honor if she was more, well, like Baldwin. You know, when I saw Ravier's design, I thought, holy crap, it's Baldwin, just a chick. That's fine. I'm cool with that. I'll take it. How is she like Baldwin? Not at all. Okay. But, you know what? I've gone on long enough on this. I really wanted to share this, but what do you guys think? What do you think of Baldwin IV now that you've heard most of his history? What do you think about his comparison to Ravier? Do you think that it's fair to compare the two at all? Who do you think is more goated? I already know who I think is more goated, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know down in the comment section below, and as always, I will see you in my next video. Take care, guys.